In this video I'm showing some different methods that I use to paint the best sellswords money can buy, the Golden Company Swordsmen. I've owned these models for quite a while, but the most recent balance update for the game has made them pretty strong, and since they're having their moment in the sun, I feel really motivated to get these models painted up. So let's launch right into it. I'm relying heavily on my airbrush, but I am also showing an alternative approach for if you don't have, or just don't want to use an airbrush. It's marked in the video timestamps, so skip ahead to that if you only want to check out that portion. I'm doing the same with oil paints, using them on my airbrushed minis, but sticking to acrylic paints only with my normal brush approach. Launching right into it, I picked the Golden Company Officer to be my test model. I do some mold line cleanup and simple basing, and then prime the model with a black-brown. Once the primer had some time to cure, I did a bit of experimenting with the gold armor. I airbrushed a couple coats of this light silver color onto the armor to set up a bright metallic undercoat. I'm going to apply a yellow filter cover over this to turn it gold, but I want to test out a few options before I commit to one. So I use a highly advanced, secret technique of spraying my silver paint onto a random piece of scrap paper, and then I airbrush a few different yellowy speed paints or contrast paints over it. Here are the three colors I picked, and I decided that a light application of Sand Golem was the way to go. I don't want my gold armor to look too much like the banana yellow that most gold paints create, and instead I want to make it look a bit more like a borderline brass color. And I think this looks really excellent. It also lets me really easily choose how much I want to tint the armor, either as a whole or individual sections or panels of the armor. I decided to focus my yellow filter on the undersides of the armor sections, and I generally keep the model flipped away from my airbrush so that I'm mostly spraying from the bottom up. With the armor airbrushed, I use my airbrush to block in, shade, and highlight as many of the other surfaces as I can. A bit of silly putty for masking helps a lot during these steps, and allows me to easily airbrush things like the head or the sword. I also don't mind if the shadow colors overspray a bit onto the gold armor, as it generally just adds some more shading and depth to the armor. It does end up making it look a bit darker than I originally intended it to though, which is a bit of a trade-off. I was also a little bit overzealous with airbrushing a grass color onto the base, and I got some on his armored feet and legs, but the good news is no one really looks at the feet of miniatures anyway. Now that I'm done with the airbrush, I do a bit of base coat and cleanup work, and then I break out an oil wash. I mix up a very dark brown oil wash thinned with a decent amount of mineral spirits, and I apply it pretty heavily over the armor and leathers. Please be safety conscious if you use oil paints, and the airbrush for that matter. And even though in miniature painting we're usually only working with small quantities of mineral spirits, I do suggest keeping your room well ventilated or wearing a respirator, or ideally do both if you're spending a long time hunched over this oil paint station. I also mix a thicker, intensely black wash and apply it to the cloth, wiping it off gently with a makeup sponge after it sits for about 10 minutes. The Mars black color I used here is a really intense and opaque black, so even after wiping it, it still stains the surfaces quite a bit, and I like this effect, but I figured I'd just mention that other black oil paints will probably behave a bit differently. Now I'm still a beginner when it comes to oil paints, but I think this got a decently nice effect. Was it worth doing over just using acrylic washes? Maybe, maybe not. I really don't think you need to use oils here, but they're just kind of fun to experiment with. From here I jump on to working on some other areas while the oil paints dry. I paint the eyes with my usual method, as well as highlighting and shading the rest of the skin. The oil paints dried overnight, so then I move on to highlighting the different parts of the model. As usual, I like pushing highlights pretty far, and I enjoy adding highlights that imply texture on larger surfaces. Quick sidebar, I'd like to explain my reasoning for choosing the Officer as my test mini. I actually like using character or unit attachment models as my test minis, and that's for a few different reasons. First reason, it's totally okay, and actually kind of a good thing, if it ends up looking slightly different than the rest of the unit. I want the special models like unit attachments to stand out as being different, since it helps with readability when you're actually playing the game. A regular unit member might look a bit off if you change things after painting a test mini, but the special character looking different just emphasizes that they're unique. Second, I notice that I usually spend more time on the first few minis that I paint in any given project, and then I start to speed up, cut corners, and get a bit more sloppy from there. By painting the special models and characters first, I'm making sure that I invest more time and effort into them, and I'm more excited to paint them instead of slogging through the process once I've already painted like 12 other minis. So all that aside, the only thing left is to quickly finish painting the base, nothing more than a typical wash and dry brush. As a test model, I'm really happy with how this guy turned out. I still have some alternative approaches I want to try, and I want to prove that an airbrush is really not necessary, so next I'm painting one of the regular soldiers using only a brush and acrylics. Ideally, I'd rattle can spray the whole unit with a brown or gray primer color, but since I'm only painting a single mini this way, for the sake of simplicity I applied a primer by brush. At first it seemed like the primer was pooling and not sitting well on the surfaces, and that could be from some mold release or something that's still on the models, so I quickly wiped the primer off before it dried, and I scrubbed the mini with some warm soapy water. I let it dry out and tried again, and this time it did seem like it worked better. Even though I liked how the armor went on the test model, just for the sake of trying something different, this time around I started by basing all the armor with a few coats of this light bronze color. I used several different thin speed paints and acrylic paints to tint and shade the armor, trying to keep the raised surfaces from being shaded too much, and sometimes using a damp brush to feather out the edge of the paint if I feel like it's going to leave too distinctive a line. Once I think the armor has enough depth and shadow color, I build up the highlights with some dry brushing and edge highlighting, working up to a pretty bright silver. Incidentally, I totally missed that this upper leg area is meant to be armor and not cloth, so I also followed the same painting steps over again on this. This does serve as a nice comparison, I think, between how the original base coat of armor looks and how it ended up after all the highlighting and shading. After this, the other surfaces are nothing out of the ordinary. I follow a pretty standard base coat, wash, and highlight method that I'm guessing most people are pretty familiar with. I do this a little out of order technically though, doing some really rough and intense layered highlights first, and then coming back with some washes and thin glazes of paint to reinforce the shadows and smooth out the transitions a bit. And the last big component of this paint job is the yellows. You can obviously paint the shields with whatever emblem or pattern or design you want, but I'm starting by painting it yellow, in keeping with the Golden Company's colors. For the fun of it, I also paint the helmet tassel thing yellow, since I've decided that bright yellow cloth will serve as my accent color on the unit. Trying to paint the shield with yellow immediately doesn't work well because of its poor coverage, so I changed directions and painted a couple thin coats of this ivory yellow mixture, which brings it to good enough for now. If you're planning on painting a freehand on the shield or applying a decal, you probably don't need to add much of a color gradient to the yellow, but if you're leaving it blank, I do suggest doing some rough highlighting and shading. To start working on adding depth to the yellow, I wet blended together some ivory with this warm yellow color. All this means is that I put some ivory on the upper corner of the shield, put yellow all around it, and while the paints are still wet, I just sort of mash them together with this back and forth brushing motion. Big flat surfaces like shields are a great place to try experimenting with techniques like this, so I encourage you to give it a shot. Don't worry if it looks a bit weird or rough at first. I do this multiple times, which gradually builds up a nice and fairly smooth color gradient across the surface. If you want what's probably the most lore-friendly shield design, just keep them this solid yellow color. But because I can't resist the opportunity, I decided on impulse that I want to freehand different unique designs on the shields to make the minis look like they all come from different miner houses. And of course my channel logo is a perfect match for the yellow shield, so I decided to go for that on this guy here. I'm no expert at freehand, but I start by just roughly sketching in lines and filling them in, keeping my paints somewhat thin. I don't follow any specific plan, I just sort of mess around and have fun with it. I keep working with adding gentle shading and highlighting until I think it looks good enough, and that's that. I got a little off track there, but I'm pretty close to done. I finish up with whatever highlights and shading I need to do, quickly finish up the base, and that's another one down. If I was painting this whole unit by brush, I'd definitely take some shortcuts and reduce how long this takes. I would recommend cutting out all the fancy highlights and shadow blending and stuff I did on the black cloth, and instead just shade it with a black wash and give it one or two quick highlights, maybe even just dry brush it. I think the yellow does end up being pretty important to add some interest to the shields and the accent cloth pieces, but obviously it's a bit tricky to paint, and it takes a good amount of both time and layers of paint. You can make it a lot easier by opting for a color like blue or green or really almost anything else instead. Maybe pick an accent color that matches the rest of your army, so that these mercenaries tie in nicely with your faction's other troops. Hopefully you don't mind, I'm going to speed up quite a bit from here on out as I finish the rest of the unit. I mix my two armor approaches together, going back to the airbrush and making a zenithal gradient with bronze and silver on the armor, and then filtering it with yellow and brown speed paints like before. Just like with the officer, I try to airbrush as many other surfaces as I can as well, introducing that dark purplish gray cloth color again, since I really like how that looked. I also work it into the shadows of my armor while I'm at it. One important difference is that I decided to save time by airbrushing as many of the yellow surfaces as I could, again using a dark ivory color to create an opaque starting layer. Then I sprayed it yellow and started working the shadows down to a rich sienna color. Some of the scarves and such were a bit too tricky to airbrush yellow without messing up the surrounding surfaces, so I'll be painting those by brush later instead. At this point, I'm more or less done with the airbrush. I really like how they look, especially the purple robes and the yellow shields. I did go a bit overboard with the black cloth airbrushing, and it kind of oversprayed onto the gold armor in a lot of places, but that's pretty easily fixable. I do a bit of rough highlighting and dry brushing on the metal surfaces, focusing mostly on the areas that I shaded too much. Another bonus of this paint scheme, by the way, is that it still looks really good when it's unfinished. Even without having the gloves and scarves and other little details painted, playing a game with this unit on the table looks awesome. Much better than the unpainted brown color they would otherwise be. Moving on, I mixed up a black-brown oil wash, and I tried applying that to the armor and the border of the yellow shield front, but it was way too runny, and it immediately bled into the surfaces around the crevices and caused some staining. So I just brushed a thin layer of gloss varnish on, both on the shields and on the big sections of armor, and once it dried I went back to applying the oil wash. This worked much better now, and I could also keep my oil wash a bit thicker now, since the glossy surfaces helped the wash to run really nicely into the recesses. Then it's on to working on all the little bits and bobs and details, shading and highlighting things like the belts, the faces, the hair, and so on. Honestly, it's kind of just a free-for-all. I just bounce around to painting whatever part I want to do next. I'm only really showing the shading and highlighting I do on the purplish black cloth surfaces, since they're the largest and most important non-armor area on the minis. But the other details get pretty much the same treatment as this. It's pretty much just cleaning up the base coat if necessary, a quick wash, and maybe one or two selective highlights. Since the yellow accent color is kind of important, I do spend some time working some layers, highlights, and glazes into the scarves and such. I start with some really intense layers that bring the yellow up to almost an ivory white, with the highlights way too blown out. And then I bring back some thin yellow and sienna glazes to smooth out the transitions and reintroduce that yellow color. Now the natural transparency of yellow paints is actually working with us instead of against us. I keep on painting whatever details I want to, but this is definitely the point where you can stop wherever you want. The main colors on the mini look nice and impactful and well defined, so everything else is really just adding extra icing to the cake. But, being the tryhard that I am, now I start undertaking the project of painting a unique freehand on each shield. I picked colors that contrast well against yellow, and I just kind of thought up some simple random patterns. Things like a random spiral, diagonal stripes, a fleur-de-lis, and I even snuck my interpretation of the House Fossaway apple sigil in, since that was fun and easy to paint. Plus, I'm really charmed by the idea of a house's coat of arms just being a literal, actual apple. Again, nothing too different here, just messing around with thin layers of paint, and mixing up a rough color match of yellow when I need to clean up any sloppy borders. I totally forgot to record this part as well, but after painting all these freehands, I just went around and neatened up the borders of all the shields, doing any shading or highlighting when needed. And finally, these bad boys are all done. I was kind of all over the place with switching up my methods and painting things out of order, but I think that kind of just goes to show that there are plenty of ways to paint a mini. Once you get the main colors on a model and give them some pop with shading and highlights, when you zoom out and put these troops on a table, it isn't even noticeable if you have small bits and details even painted up or not. I do paint a lot of Song of Ice and Fire minis, so I'm planning to bounce around between this and all of my different board game painting projects. Hopefully you don't mind the topics being a bit disjointed, and let me know if there's a specific series or game you want me to keep focusing on. I'll probably be starting even more projects with Oathsworn and the Stormlight Archives minis on my desk now too, so I hope you'll humor me and stick around for all these other projects. As always, thank you for watching, feel free to ask me any questions, take care, and I do hope you have a great day.